In an article Michael Norman wrote about the Vietnam War, and he said, "War makes men like me, hollow men, men weighed down by memory, out of time and out of place, men who spend their lives trying to recover what has been lost, men hunted by the awful mystery that spared them, that left them alone walking in empty spaces." The various experiences of Vietnam veterans went through before, during, and after the war were truly life-changing. My dad broke his elbow and couldn't extend his arm completely, otherwise he would have been in the Vietnam War. He had several friends that went to Vietnam and Korea during the Vietnam War, and they don't talk about what happened unless it's with someone else that went through the war as well. I'll be giving you a brief overview of the Vietnam War and go into soldiers' lives before, during, and after the war. The Vietnam War lasted 19 years, from 1954 until 1975. The main purpose of the war was to stop the spread of communism to other countries. North Vietnam was a communist country and was trying to overtake South Vietnam to spread communism there as well. The people of South Vietnam did not want communism and couldn't stop North Vietnam from invading. The United States was not asked to help liberate South Vietnam, but we just decided to intervene and took over the influence that the French had in South Vietnam. The Vietnam War lasted over 4 presidencies: Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. In 1957, the Eisenhower Doctrine committed the United States to defending Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan from communism influence. In 1961, when Kennedy was president, there were 2,000 United States troops in Vietnam. In 1965, 4 years later, when Johnson was president, there was 82,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. 6 months later, in December 1965, there was 175,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. Less than 2 years later, in November 1967, there was over 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. The various reports that I found showed between $111 billion to $120 billion were spent during the 19 years of the Vietnam War. In 2008 terms, that equals at least $686 billion. Before the Vietnam War in 1954, there were many wars and conflicts with different countries about different things. The Korean War lasted from 1950 until 1953. There was also the Suez Crisis in 1956, the Berlin Crisis of 1961, and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Prior to the Korean War was the end of the World War II from 1945 until 1947. During the Vietnam War, soldiers had various living conditions. In Vietnam, they had to travel through jungle as best they could and traveled on dirt roads. The weather conditions were tropical rains and blazing heat. Artillerymen would sleep on the ground or sometimes would dig holes to sleep in to avoid being seen. If soldiers were in charge of driving tanks, they were allowed to sleep in the tanks, or they could have just slept right outside of the tanks. Some men slept on wooden ammo crates filled with dirt. Vietnam veterans that had the better living conditions were the military police, mechanics, the injured or sick, clerks, and cooks. They got to sleep in wood hooches. Hooches were wooden buildings that had screen doors and were wooden structures that had aluminum roofs. Hooches is a Vietnamese name for a small house. The draft started in 1969 and lasted until 1973. 1,750,000 men were drafted in that time. Women were mostly nurses during wartime, and some 7,500 women served in the Vietnam War. Some other jobs women had were data processing equipment, stenographers, typists, clerks, translators, intelligence officers, and photojournalists. Nurses generally worked 12-hour shifts for 6 days a week. Only one woman was killed in Vietnam in June of 1969. Some reports showed that with women in Vietnam, it helped boost the morale of male soldiers, and they enjoyed having them there. There are reports that 11 to 22 million gallons of a herbicide called Agent Orange was dumped from planes during the Vietnam War as herbicidal warfare. It was used to destroy food crops, forests, and trees and bushes along roadsides. Agent Orange is made of a herbicide that forms into a toxic dioxin compound. The United States government told the veterans of Vietnam that Agent Orange was harmless. Agent Orange has caused health issues with Vietnamese people and U.S. Vietnam veterans. There are endless health-related issues caused by Agent Orange, including cancer, nerve, digestive, skin, and respiratory disorders. Veterans that served in South Vietnam had higher rates of throat cancer, acute and chronic leukemia, Hodgkin's lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, prostate cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer, soft tissue sarcoma, and liver cancer. The use of Agent Orange in Vietnam was banned in 1968, but was used for 3 more years until 1971. Vietnam veterans also suffered from dysentery, fevers, snake bites, and jungle rot. They also had to endure vicious booby traps. While in Vietnam, veterans also became addicted to morphine or opiates and alcohol, and these behaviors continued when they came home back to the United States. The bad feelings that Vietnam veterans received from United States citizens were caused by some reports that veterans had massacred entire villages because South Vietnamese people were sheltering North Vietnamese in their homes. And since veterans couldn't tell who the enemy was, because they all looked the same because they're all from North and South Vietnam. 61% of the men that served in Vietnam were younger than 21 years old. Over 58,000 U.S. troops were killed in Vietnam, 1,000 are missing in action, and 150,000 were seriously wounded. When Vietnam veterans came home from Vietnam, there were anti-war movements happening all over the United States, mostly in colleges. In 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio, 2,000 students gathered for protest of the invasion of Cambodia. 4 students were killed during the protest and 9 were injured. There were various events leading up to the shooting, and reports claim that students were throwing rocks at the National Guardsmen and yelling at them. When the National Guard was moving away from their people, they slowly followed after them and still yelling and throwing objects. After that was when 29 of the 77 National Guardsmen said they started firing shots off. 2 of the students were killed that were participating in the protest. The other 2 were just walking from one class to the next. Some believe that the anti-war movements were so prevalent during the Vietnam War was because it was the first televised war. Many anti-war and anti-government protesters hated Vietnam veterans simply because they participated in the war. Although many volunteered to go and some were drafted, they were mandated to go and believed in the war. Some reports of Vietnam veterans being spat on happen a lot at airports. Because in order for veterans to receive discounted airfare, they had to be in their uniforms. Anti-war protesters would go to airports for the sole purpose of spitting on veterans. In conclusion, Vietnam veterans' participation in the war was either looked upon as valiant or for no good reason. The various experiences Vietnam veterans went through before, during, and after the war were truly life-changing. Before, during, and after the Vietnam War were each vastly different stages that any veteran thought it would be. Sadly, there are still people that still have hate towards Vietnam veterans, but they fought for our country whether the war was supported or not. The troops should have been supported when they came home.